Welcome to this special Issues and Answers interview. I'm Ian Boyne. Today we have the honor of interviewing the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Mr. Robert Azevedo. The WTO is an important global institution which has significant impacts on countries like Jamaica. We talked to Mr. Azevedo about the role of the WTO as well as some of the controversial issues which have attended its work. We thank you so much for your company. Mr. Azevedo, welcome to Jamaica and welcome to Issues and Answers. Good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good. Could you tell us how the WTO works in the interests of countries like Jamaica? How do we benefit from the work of the World Trade Organization?
Well, in today's world, I think it's undeniable that with the degree of integration that you have amongst all the economies, trade is a very important part of all this new 21st century scenario. I clearly think that if you are going to be pursuing trade policies and a trade conversation, the WTO is the best forum for countries like Jamaica to begin with, because they have a seat at the table. Number two, because their voice is as important and has the same value as any other voice around the table. It's an organization that decides by consensus. So in order to have something approved in the WTO, every single member has to be comfortable with what's being approved. So if you're looking at the world today with all these regional agreements, these mega trade agreements, the small economies are left behind. They're completely outside the shaping of the trade agenda and the shape of the global economy agenda if they don't have a multilateral conversation.
But haven't the agreements worked against the interests of countries like Jamaica? For example, agreements that limit the freedom that countries have to apply tariffs, to apply measures to protect domestic industry. That has been a big concern, that removing trade barriers work against the interests of developing countries like Jamaica. What is your response to that?
It's a trade-off. Every time that there is a negotiation on reducing tariffs, for example, it is a negotiation that involves a give and take process. So the fact that some members are lowering their tariffs, it's because they're getting some kind of market access or some kind of compensation in another area of the negotiation. So nobody is opening up their markets without looking at the balance of the negotiations to begin with. Secondly, the developing countries and countries like Jamaica still a very high level of tariffs. In the case of agricultural products, for example, I think the average tariff for Jamaica is 97% or something like that. It's a very high tariff. But when Jamaica applies the tariffs, it applies at much lower levels. So there is a distinction between the binding tariffs, so the tariffs which are bound under the WTO commitments, and the tariffs which are actually applied. Most of the developing countries apply tariffs at a level which is much, much lower than the level of their bound commitments.
So there is some level of flexibility, there is some differentiation.
Absolutely, absolutely. There is a very ample space for policy, what we call policy space, in the schedule of the developing countries in general.
Yes, yeah. What do you think about your views on the discussion going on now about the reclassification of middle-income countries like Jamaica? I know there are particular preferential regimes that apply to the least developed countries, but there's an argument that, especially since the global crisis, middle-income countries like Jamaica have really been badly affected and really should be given the kinds of considerations that the LDCs are given.
The debate in Geneva is very sensitive on this issue of classification.
Yes.
Because wherever you draw a line, it doesn't matter whether you're drawing a line for middle-income countries or for what some call upper middle income countries.
right.
Wherever you draw a line, there will be countries that will be very close to that line, just inches below or inches above.
Yes.
And there is always a very strong and dramatic debate about countries that are just above the cutoff or just below the cutoff, when they are actually, if you look at those countries, very similar sometimes. So I think the way forward in this conversation has to be something that takes into account the individual possibilities, the potentialities, and the ability of countries to contribute. And you have to be flexible there. You may have countries which are even very similarly situated in terms of some economic indicators, but they are as far as their political realities, they're in completely different worlds. So you have to take all those things into account and be flexible in the approach. That's why we have been very successful in the last couple of ministerial meetings, because we have been able to take into account these more flexible approaches and adopting negotiation structures and formats which allow for these differentiated outcomes.
Yes. We're speaking to the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Mr. Robert Azevedo. We take a break, but we'll be right back.
Stop! Don't turn a blind eye to child abuse, child neglect, and child labor. If you know or even suspect child abuse, call the Children's Registry. Together, we can make a difference.
We're speaking to the Director General of the very powerful multilateral organization, the World Trade Organization, Mr. Robert Azevedo. Mr. Azevedo, what are your comments on Jamaica's economic reform program, the steps it has been taking in trade facilitation, ease of doing business, that kind of thing?
They're extremely important. I think for an economy like Jamaica, with the size of the economy, the access that it has to markets which have pretty much opened themselves up to Jamaica completely, trade should be at the top of the agenda. And you cannot have successful trade policies without having an environment which is friendly for business. And I think Jamaica has done a tremendous effort in this area, successfully, by the way, moving up in the ranking of ease of doing business list. I think that trade facilitation is extremely important, particularly in island states like Jamaica, where interconnectivity is a problem, where the costs of trade is usually higher, lack of scale because of the size of the economy. So lowering the costs of doing trade is absolutely fundamental if you want to benefit from trade. And Jamaica is doing tremendous steps in that direction.
And you think that generally the country ought to continue on this path, that this is the only viable path?
Absolutely. And you see examples all over the world, particularly small economies. It is very difficult to see an economy with a small scale market justifying investments, justifying production in the higher end of the global value chains. For that to happen, you have to be fully integrated into the global markets. If you're not, you're going to be left behind. And it's not about the size of the economy. It's about the platform that that country offers for investors and for companies who want to do business, not only for the domestic market. You're talking about in the Caribbean, here in Jamaica, globally speaking, very small markets, but that can be very well connected in the global trade flows.
But there have been leading scholars in economics, Hajung Chang, Danny Roderick, who have pointed out that developing countries like Jamaica have not benefited from liberalization, Mr. Azevedo, that this whole scale liberalization has not resulted in the kind of economic growth that we should have. And that in fact the period after World War II, when Latin America was most protectionist, it grew faster than the liberalization era. What's your response?
But models exhaust themselves. And I read some of those books and studies myself, and they're comparing apples to oranges. These are completely different moments in history. You're talking about economy. So, for example, the whole argument that the industrialized countries had high tariffs when they were industrializing, they had very big domestic markets. So those countries had a basis to produce to in a very large consumer market. And the conditions for integration at that point in time, transportation was high, the timing for doing business was completely different. Those markets were mostly independent from each other. Today you have a world economy where the cost of doing business has lowered dramatically since the event of the container, the standardization, communications, the integration and the ability to buy and sell. It's completely different. You're talking about a completely different set of rules of engagement. Now, if you look at today's world, that old model doesn't work any longer. Today, it's about competitiveness. Today, it's about how well can you compete in the global markets? How can you make sure that somebody who is doing business in your country can tap not only your market, but also the markets that are close by, the markets that they can be accessed from this platform. If you miss that point, you miss the whole picture. Now, that's not something that the private sector can do alone. That's not something that the government can do alone. This is something that has to have a coherent strategy that looks at all the elements of the productive chain, and that has to do with not only the regulatory environment, but also the supply side constraints that have to be addressed in each country. There is no single recipe, something that works for everyone. Each country will have to find the right ingredients for a recipe that will make a successful trade environment.
Yeah. But it is said, Mr. Azevedo, that the power of the WTO rules make it difficult for developing countries to find that space.
On the contrary, it makes it much easier. Because, absolutely. Can you imagine a world where the developed countries, the big economic powerhouses, could have complete discretion about where they buy from, how they buy from, who they buy from, and the rules that they apply for each country? It would be a no man's land. It would be the rule of the jungle, and the powerful would rule. Now, in the situation that we have today, no country, doesn't matter how big or small, can discriminate.
It's a rules-based system.
So the rules are there, they are predictable, they're stable, and they are enforceable. That's what differentiates the WTO from every other organization in the world.
Very important.
We have a dispute settlement system where we ensure that the might and the power of a country does not prevail over the rules.
Yes. Your comments on the recent successes of the 10th Ministerial meeting in Nairobi. They were historic.
It was hard. It was very, very hard. Because we did not make much progress in Geneva. So by the time that we got to Nairobi, we had 15 issues, which were still open-ended. Yes. So it was a mess in terms of process, in terms of even concepts. So we had to resort to ministers to help facilitate issues. Minister Nicholson of Jamaica helped us in the rules negotiations. Yeah, he was the facilitator there. And like him, we had others who were helping in different parts of the negotiations. And fortunately, at the end of the process, we managed to pull through a very significant package, which is, I think, actually it's the first time that the WTO has delivered significantly in 2 consecutive ministerial meetings. It has never happened before. This is a historical.
And big success on the matter of agricultural subsidies.
Absolutely. This is something that we had been fighting to get for
long
God
time.
knows how long.
Absolutely.
When I joined the diplomatic career, there was already a fight.
Absolutely.
And now we finally got
That's a
rid of
major
the export
breakthrough.
subsidies. It is. And I'm very happy that we are managing to keep, to the extent that we can, the agenda of the developing countries at the center of the negotiations. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be a situation where you get everything you want, but we're taking gradual steps. And compared to the previous situation, which was we were taking no steps whatsoever, this is a big improvement of the system, for the system.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so very much.
To have you, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, one of the most important organizations in the world, and an organization that has a significant impact on your life. Mr. Robert Azevedo has been our special guest. We thank you for your company. Next week we'll be back. Until then, Ian Boyne wishing you a pleasant day.